Right, well, here we are. What is profound giftedness? I'm Matthew Line. I'll be taking you through the topic today. It's an interesting topic because depending on who you ask, you'll get a lot of different answers. Depending on the intelligence assessments used, you'll get a lot of different answers. There's a lot of misinformation floating around. A lot of things that are still unknowns. And as such, you're going to get a slew of different opinions. You can fact check me. You'll find an awful lot of the things many people would consider dated. However, due to the lack of actual better tools of distinguishing gifted people one from another, I think that what I'm providing here is among some of the most accurate and comprehensive answers you can get in a little bit of a YouTube video. So, without further ado, let's get going. First, we're going to talk about IQ scores and some miscellaneous stuff. Then we're finally going to talk about the kind of the core of what we're going at: intensity, development, social relationships, and authority. So basically, how do we profoundly gifted people deal with the world? Now that we're talking about IQ scores, we can talk about levels of giftedness. There are some things that annoy me about testing, and I'll discuss those as well. Additionally, I'll bring up the problem of bad information, because lots of times there are different opinions brought up by different people and different psychologists that are constantly trying to, with all the best intentions, improve testing, improve the metrics, improve education. But I think that whether people realize it or not, profoundly gifted people do wind up getting the shaft, because they make it much more difficult to distinguish different types of giftedness one from another. In terms of levels of giftedness, gifted is 130 plus, highly gifted is 145 plus, exceptionally gifted is 160 plus, and profoundly gifted is 175 or 180 plus, depending on your different ranges of the tests. But if we think of it in terms of standard deviations 2, 3, 4, and 5, that makes the most sense. What annoys me about the testing is that, for example, the Wechsler scale has a max score of 160. Stanford Binet, especially Form 5, doesn't do too good of a job of distinguishing really smart people one from another, because it's practically impossible to get a score over 155. And still, there are marked differences in between someone of an IQ of 160 and someone with an IQ of 200. You'll find that, especially in early childhood, you can see a big difference, because you rate the person of 160 and the rate that the person of a 200 IQ do things like reading and writing and math and speaking and communicating. Obviously, there's variance within an IQ range, but generally, there's a big enough difference in between it, and the current tests don't do all that good of a job. I guess the best one would be the Wechsler extended scale tests, or the Stanford Binet Form LM. The Stanford Binet Form LM is a little older, but it is easier to use to distinguish one gifted person from another. Additionally, if you keep in mind what the standard deviations are, and the fact that people really haven't changed all that much over the course of the past 50, 60 years, both of these are pretty good solutions for the problem. fact of the matter is, once you do wind up getting a certain number of standard deviations, when you're 5 standard deviations, you can kind of expect something. When you're 4 standard deviations, you can expect something else. So as long as you get a general ballpark figure, but you can distinguish the one standard deviation from the other, I'm guessing that's good enough, especially given the fact that at least parents and caretakers should have the sense to provide age-appropriate / developmentally appropriate materials. The problem with bad information is that people believe the first thing that they hear or read. So if one psychologist says, oh, well, this test doesn't work, or that test doesn't work, or we can't possibly rely on these scales or tests, or why don't we just go lump all this other stuff together, etc., people don't actually go do their own research, and people don't go spending time with profoundly gifted people in order to see the great variability that exists amongst profoundly gifted people. Yeah, we are a small sample size, but there is a great variability amongst us. And, well, I think this is one of those things that you just need to do a little searching and find out your own information rather than just relying on what other people say. Lots of people don't want to go and look at percentiles and standard deviations. And lots of people don't want to actually acknowledge the existence of profound giftedness. This is especially in the public education systems, because there is no money in helping profoundly gifted people. Profoundly gifted people are largely left on their own, except the existence of a few foundations that are kind of willing to help, simply because there isn't any money in it. We are such a small base of people that doing something special for us isn't actually reasonable for most people to consider. I think that educating people about this problem is still the solution. And ultimately, I think the profoundly gifted people need to take it into their own hands to mentor up-and-coming young profoundly gifted people and their parents and their families. And it needs to be widely known that there exist communities for them to join. And the people with bad attitudes just need to stay out of these communities in order that people that are legitimately there seeking help can do so. I actually think that these communities and educational groups need to be such that people that can't necessarily keep up should be directed to another group, because if there is too much of a gap in between the students in terms of their development, a lot of resentment and hard feelings tend to occur. And this, I've noticed, especially tends to occur in between people of 150 to 170 IQ and then 175 to 200 IQ. It's an incredibly nasty situation, and most of it is actually brought up by parents and not the children themselves, because the kids will just get together and do whatever they can. So I think the parents do need to be very careful they choose to do with their time, and that they don't misunderstand standing up for their own children's needs as beating others down. Some miscellaneous things. We feel strongly and think deeply about almost everything. I mean, I was about a week and a half ago. Was it that long ago? No, it was even longer than that ago. Anyhow, this autumn, I was walking. I crushed a slug. I crushed a slug. It happened to be on the path that I was walking, and that me apart. Frustration also happens pretty easily because there's a whole lot of ideas floating around, a whole lot of people that have their own opinions on things, and they've thought things to a certain extent. And because profoundly gifted people think about things so deeply and feel things so strongly, we likely have already established very strong opinions on a matter. Then people constantly come and questioning you, and people constantly coming and trying to argue with you and do those sorts of things. It's one thing if you're just kind of sharpening one's arguing skills by engaging in lighthearted banter and arguing, and it's another thing if people are constantly calling into question your worldview just to rip you apart, or just to somehow prove that I'm right and you're wrong, and that's the end of it. That is very difficult to deal with. Some people respond actively, other people respond passively, and I would say the majority of us do wind up responding passively and have to learn how to actively stand up for ourselves in social circumstances. Otherwise, it's, it's pretty difficult to deal with. Oh yeah, if we do have a religious view. The atheists are very strong atheists, very well thought out. The Christians are very well thought out Christians. The Muslims are very well thought out Muslims. The idea of religion resonates very strongly with us in whatever it is that we happen to believe. We line our lives up with it pretty. Here's your belief, here's your life. They both wind up going in the same direction. Communication often tends to be kept to a minimum just because, well, we don't particularly desire to spend 3 hours explaining something that can be explained in 3 sentences to somebody that would actually understand us. It's a little bit of hyperbole, but not much. Intensity. I know we talked about strong thoughts and feelings, but intensity goes to even more things. I'll give an example that we oftentimes just take things to the next level. We take things to extremes. If we want to learn music, we're going to want to be Mozart. If we want to learn about aviation, we're going to want to be as innovative as the Wright brothers were. If we're trying to do math, we're going to push it all the way and understand things to the nth degree. It's going to be intense, and it's going to be a whirlwind. It's going to be almost impossible for others to keep up with us because we follow things with such a passion. I was into designing airplanes when I was 3 or so years old, and I wanted to design good airplanes. I wanted to design airplanes that would do certain things, and my parents were kind enough to take me to the university library, and I found some aeronautical engineering textbooks, and I realized that in order to understand this stuff, I first need to learn my calculus. So I then convinced my parents I was afraid of the dark. Why did I do that? Because my dad had a calculus book from his university studies in the basement. It was calculus and analytical geometry. And I wanted a flashlight. So I pretended to be afraid of the dark. I waited until my parents got me a flashlight. I snuck into the basement, and I read the calculus book from cover to cover. And my mom, she oftentimes dropped things into the trash can and would sift through things to find whatever she was looking for, so I couldn't possibly risk doing the problems on pieces of paper. I couldn't set fire to the paper because then smoke alarms would go off and you leave a smoky residue and people would wonder what I was up to, so I wound up having to do all the calculations in my head. So I wound up teaching myself to do calculus in my head just because I wanted to learn aeronautical engineering. And I wound up doing things like statics and dynamics and mechanics and materials, and just took everything to extremes, and eventually I wound up designing my own airplanes. You'll find amongst profoundly gifted people, whatever their area of interest is, they will pursue it with great intensity. In terms of development, there are a few different points, but it all generally surrounds around the idea of developmental appropriateness. What do I mean by developmental appropriateness? I mean that parents, caretakers, and teachers actually need to know what to do. They need to have the courage to take the book and throw it out. They need to have the courage to do their best. It's not enough to do your best. You must know what to do and then do your best. So what is actually best is something that's developmentally appropriate, not let's look at this book, see exactly what it says, now let's make sure that our kiddo can do this. I know people that are profoundly gifted that shut down at that. I know people that refuse to even do the easy steps of an IQ test because they thought it was too stupid for them. And so they had to be basically taken onto the later questions without doing the earlier stuff just because they couldn't stand it. And then regarding parenting, I think it's very important to know that, as Laurel Ingalls Wilder said, every job is good if you do your best and work hard. A man who works hard stinks only to the ones that have nothing to do but smell. So there's an awful lot of hard work and there's an awful lot of stinking, because there's an awful lot of doing things that are completely counter to social norms and counter to what the culture would tell you to do. And that stinks to a lot of people. And they'll be holding their nose, they'll be pointing, and they'll be saying, oh, that stinks, that's bad. So for parents of PG kids, just block it out. Just block it out. You will likely lose your friends. You will likely lose respect. People will think that you're lying. People will think that you're attention seeking, and it's not. It's just intense. You need to have the courage to deal with it and to provide your kiddos with what is appropriate. If you look at pictures, you'll find that we're not all that weird looking. I mean, we might be alert, very alert as infants, and constantly sucking in information. Others might be very, very sleepy. But in general, you'll notice different things about alertness and attention that differentiates a profoundly gifted kid from one that's not. I was constantly looking at things, and my mom was very kind in terms of providing me explanations of things that I would point at and ask about. What's that? What's this? What's that? And I would get an idea of how the world around me worked. Regarding intensity, going back to this picture, I actually don't know how old I was. I was just grabbing some pictures off of, what is it? Snapfish. And an awful lot of my childhood pictures were gone. So this is what I had left. When I was about 4 months old, I spoke my first sentence. Those were my first words, were my first sentence. I was at the store. My mom walked around the corner. I was sitting in the shopping cart. I yelled out, "Mommy, come here." And I got a whole bunch of stares, apparently. And from that point on, my parents went grocery shopping at night in order that they wouldn't get the stares, because I would be going and saying and doing things that I guess were unexpected. I always loved seeing how things work. And tractors were fun, airplanes were fun, and so funny because that look of intensity, I'm already seeing that on my daughter's face, and it's so fun to watch her just paying attention to everything going on and responding very accurately to what my wife and I are saying, even though she can't actually speak yet. She's only a few 1, 2.5 weeks old. Doing things like walking, just at a normal age. I think I was 9 months old when I walked. Reading. At least when I was 1.5 years old, I could read. I don't know exactly when I could read because I didn't say anything about it when I did. The first time that I indicated that I could read was when we drove past an abortion clinic, and there was this guy dressed up like the Reaper with the sickle, and then there was this guy who was holding a sign that said "Abortion kills babies." And when we passed that, they were doing a silent protest, so I couldn't hear anything. Nobody could hear anything. They were just standing there in front of the Planned Parenthood clinic. And I asked my dad, why do they kill babies? And my dad didn't answer me. He noticed a fire truck pulling out of the fire station, so he followed it. So basically, ever since I've been, about 1.5 years old, I've been pro-life. Loved to help around the house. My mom made chores and helping fun. Got to be mommy's big helper and run the sweeper, and I got to be grandma's helper and do the dishes. I loved music. I hated out-of-tune music. Loved talking to my grandma. And we had a balance of work and play, but we didn't get to go out and do anything until the dishes were done. So Grandma taught me how to do the dishes. You'd wash it in as warm of water as you can. You rinse it in as warm of water as you can, and you'd wipe them dry and don't let them cry. And I still remember it. My other grandma also liked having helpers. I didn't even know that these pictures were being taken. I was just helping beat the rugs. So much fun. Liked ice cream. Had general, just things that children like. In fact, it oftentimes seemed like a switch. Like I would do children's things, then I would do adults' things, then I would go back to do children's things, and so on. And that has to do with the asynchrony in development. That you're looking at mental development that's far, far above your emotional and physical development. And that's exceptionally interesting when I started asking questions about AIDS and sex, and I biologically knew what I understood the biology, but then actually biologically I wasn't, sexually mature or anything, and neither was I emotionally mature enough to deal with the actual subject matter. So constantly balancing all this stuff was pretty much a nightmare, and without understanding parents, that would have been an awful lot more difficult. I loved using the globe and seeing where different people that we knew lived, and looking at distances, looking at the shortest distance to fly between places, going and then spinning the globe one way and then spinning the globe the other way and saying, "Hey, mommy, 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 I'm making time go backwards." That was always fun. Going fishing with my uncles. My parents did everything they possibly could in order to make my childhood as normal as it could be. In fact, they didn't really emphasize my education much at all. It was mostly self-guided education. I mean, they supported me, At least when they knew what I was up to. They didn't know I was sneaking down into the basement to read calculus books until I told them when I was much older. But generally when I would do something, they were very supportive and helpful. My uncles and my grandma never doubted my parents. They were just whatever it was that my parents decided to do, whatever weird thing Matthew happened to be doing at the time. They would just smile and talk about it and have a nice family time. Went to the Olympics. This is my dad's mom. She came and visited, and we drove down to Atlanta for the 1996 Olympic Games. I got to see Michael Johnson run his really, really fast 200-meter run. I think it was a world record at the time. I just remember he was fast. Always having goals and wanting to do things, so Dad would just let me. I wanted to pull him in the stroller or in the wagon, so he didn't help me. I remember going over the corner was exceptionally difficult. I distinctly remember pulling him, and then I wound up slightly after this. I had a two-hand hold on the thing, and I dug my heels in because I got the wheel stuck in the corner of the sidewalk. I did get him past that point, though. I was so proud of myself. My little brother was born when I was 4 years old. Here he is. This is certainly under a year. He would be 9 months old. And I had asked him to help take out the power supply for my new piano that I got on my birthday. And he did. He was and always understood what was going on. Very, very clever in his own right. He just happened to be living in my shadow, and it wasn't all that easy for him. But once I actually wound up moving out of the house, he quickly put his big boy pants on and filled those shoes in ways I could never imagine doing. In pottery class and art class, I did the bare minimum. I did the bare minimum to make my art projects or whatever functional or to fit the requirements. I wouldn't go and add the extra touches and try to do things to make it fancy. I was always emphasizing, okay, have I fit the requirements? Okay, I'm not going to do any more. I didn't. Art wasn't really my thing. Got to go to the Chicago Museum of Science, or Chicago Children's Museum. They did it such that my dad hopped on an earlier plane, and I hopped onto this plane. I wanted to practice going on an airplane myself. And so, the one thing I really wanted to have a picture taken of was the big globe. I loved the big globe. And that was incredibly fun to go see. And to sit and just look at the scale and realize how puny that globe is and still how small we are in the whole scheme of things. Later, I got into actual playing the real piano as opposed to playing the electronic keyboard. This guy here, Jim Williams, was my first piano teacher, and he was amazing. An incredibly caring man, incredibly bright man. He was a chemist who taught piano on the side. I think the world of him. He's very, very fond memories of him. And this guy, Frank Schaefer here. Old guy, member of the Columbus Symphony Orchestra. He played the flute. And he would always go and ask me what I was playing and what I was learning, and was very supportive. Came to many of my auditions, and I'm very fortunate to have both of them in my life. I finally got into, when I was 6 years old, model airplane flying. It was the same time I got into piano playing. And when I did model airplane flying, I flew little model airplanes, and around the time I was 11, there was this Youth Masters competition in which there were these 2.6 meter 100cc airplanes that we got to fly and compete against other people 16 and below. And there were two categories, basic and advanced. And I noticed that Brandon Simmons wasn't doing a particularly good job, but I knew he had potential. It was obvious by the way that he flew. And so I offered to call for him, and he accepted the offer. And we talked about airplanes, and we were able to really bond over airplanes. And honestly, being able to call for him meant a lot more than the fact that I did win advanced against people much older than me. That meant infinitely more than this. Aviation was once again a big thing. This guy here, Mike Barbie, was a fantastic role model. He owned his own business, built model airplanes, poured concrete. Right now he is a world caliber radio controlled airplane pilot. If you look up Mike Barbie and you spell it like it's written on the back of his shirt, you'll see some pretty amazing pictures of some stuff that he's done. As a teenager, I wound up spending every single Saturday, except for a few, in Mike's basement. This one was a Christmas gift that I got him. I got him a special roll-out cutting mat, self-healing cutting mat that he could use for cutting airplane covering and other things like that. It was such a joy to work in the basement with Mike. And here we're missing a whole bunch of pictures, so I picked one where we're playing a game of Uno with two of my mom's high school friends, one who was sitting here and then one who's here outside of the scope of the picture. My little brother would have been over here as well. And I know that this lady, made an absolutely rotten joke. This guy, my dad, responded to it. And I was there drinking Mountain Dew. And this is right before Mountain Dew gushed out of my nose and mouth, and I was able to confine it all into the cup. But they made fun of me for that. But I do remember there were raunchy jokes were abundant during this conversation, and which means that my mom gave all sorts of weird looks for all of us that were telling the bad jokes because she didn't do so herself. In terms of relationships, this will be the first time I've actually told anyone outside of my own family this out aloud. And in order to respect people's privacy, I'll keep names out of it. But just say during my teenage years, someone that I intended to get married to died. We were very close. She had a stroke in the middle of winter, and that was that. She was then kept alive by machines, and because she was essentially brain dead after the stroke, her parents finally did take her off life support. The more I think about it, the more I think that that might have. Well, first off, it provided an opportunity for the family to grow closer, their family. And second off, I know that if we would have gotten married and had kids, due to the fact that she had heart problems from infancy on, it would have been very dangerous for us to have children, and the children that we had might have been left without a mom. It doesn't make it any easier. But at the same time, it did open up the situation for me to get married to the lady that I did get married to. Which in and of itself was the entire dating process and getting to know her process was a nightmare. It was difficult. Didn't make too much sense. got to deal an awful lot with the mental versus emotional versus physical maturity aspect of things. She was 3 years older than me, so it wasn't that big of a deal. We actually met before the aforementioned girl died. I can tell you who this is. It was Marta, that's my wife. Eventually, we wound up getting married when I was 20. When I was 20 years old, we got married. And just recently, we had our first child, September 22nd this year. I learned an awful lot about women in life in my dating, and I also knew very early after meeting Marta that very few people in the entire world could hold a candle to her. And so it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that somehow, someway we were going to get married, because I couldn't possibly imagine settling for less. She was intelligent. She was very beautiful. I mean, she is still intelligent and still is very beautiful. Very capable, very artistic, incredibly feminine. She balances me in every conceivable way. Very understanding, very much a people person. She makes me look good. In terms of the fact that if I weren't with her, I would I'd look pretty terrible. There's our little one. This picture was taken Friday, Saturday, Sunday, 4 days after she was born. At that point, she was either eyes wide open, looking everywhere, trying to find out what's going on, or completely dead to the world. There was no in between. Now, on to social relationships. These may seem like interesting topics. Ditzy, blonde, or Spock. Not necessarily introverted and intelligent. Let's see, what do I mean by that? A stereotypical ditzy blonde will go and play up any aspect of her, or blonde if you get rid of the E of him, that isn't intelligence. Anything that doesn't happen in between the ears. And lots of times, if the situation calls for it, you just don't act smart. You can fool some unintelligent people into thinking that you're actually not intelligent by not acting intelligent, but pretty much anyone who's actually intelligent won't get fooled. But the ditzy blonde act does help. At least it helps kind of grease the social skids. But you always have to be cognizant of the situation around you, and the fact that it takes an awful lot of effort to just kind of shut yourself off, and to hold yourself back and hold yourself in and keep everything all bottled up. But if you don't, then you risk coming off as Spock, or you risk coming off as some sort of this unemotional, uncaring, detached person, just because you're operating it from a completely different standpoint than most people do. And that makes dealing with people very, very difficult. There is another way of dealing with it, and it's called making something, making a product, etc. You can express creativity through art, you can express creativity through music, you can express creativity in multiple other ways. And that's the ways that many gifted creative people have done in the past. We are not necessarily introverted, although an awful lot of what we do comes out across as introverted. Has all more to do with the fact that we make lots of connections, lots of complex connections. And if we're connecting on our terms, then this means that other people will be completely left sniffing our exhaust. And if we connect on their terms, we're constantly pressing on the brake pedals. So, Hollingworth said in 1942, the more intelligent a person is, regardless of age, the less often he can find a truly congenial companion. And unfortunately, that is very much the case. Um, Connecting on other people's terms completely wears you down, and most people don't have the wherewithal to. Most profoundly gifted people don't have the wherewithal to stand it. But then connecting on your own terms is difficult because not many other people can actually keep up. Highly gifted people can to some extent, exceptionally gifted people can to a bigger extent, but really you don't feel too much at home unless you're with another profoundly gifted person or someone considerably older or more experienced than you. I wound up spending most of my time with old people from the time I've been little. Is it really intelligent? A lot of the times you don't necessarily feel intelligent. You feel lonely. You feel like you're boggled down with layers of unapparent connections, and sometimes you just either despise intelligence as a gift or you just don't. Sometimes you wish you could just look at the world through other people's lenses and have that be enough for you. But this layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of analysis and understanding and figuring out what's going on can be very exhausting. I'm not saying this because I think that I'm somehow better than anyone else. I'm just saying this because profoundly gifted people are different. And the sooner that that is recognized, the sooner you can do something about it, and the sooner you can hopefully find support or mentors or people that can actually appreciate intelligence for what it is rather than beating it down and making you feel really, really stupid for even bothering to open your mouth. Lots of times you do end up having to take baby steps when you'd rather take giant leaps. This definitely goes down when you're dealing with people that are considerably older than you or have more life experience or are really, really subject matter experts. I highly recommend getting in touch with subject matter experts of whatever it is that you're doing and whatever it is that you're interested in, and focusing on working with those rather than with the peons that don't actually understand what's going on. Profoundly gifted people deal with authority in very strange ways. Now, respect is a big thing, but respect is also very difficult to earn. You respect a person for being a person, but that's a certain amount of respect. Competence is a characteristic that someone can have that will make you respect them a lot more. And if someone isn't competent, then why in the world would that person be telling you anything? Why in the world would you be expecting to learn from somebody that doesn't actually know what they're talking about in the first place? Why in the world would you be expecting to engage with somebody that you know you're not actually going to be able to move forward in life with? And I'm saying this, of course, from the perspective of a go-getter type A personality male. So take this for what it's worth. But I suck at being under authority unless I respect the person that I am under authority, which means that this person needs to be competent. If said person is not competent, I can tolerate it, I can deal with it, but I'm soon going to be seeking uh, some other kind of a leader if I want to be led, or just going and leading myself because I can't stand other people's plans and ill thought out ideas. Being under authority is a very, very difficult thing to do, and unfortunately, because being under authority is oftentimes a prerequisite in the job ladder to being in authority, this is where an awful lot of people who are profoundly gifted careers begin to crumble, because they constantly have different ideas on how to do things, and most people can't keep up with it, don't see the value in it, and feel threatened by it. Being in authority, I would say, very focused on facts. Do the facts say that things will work? Do the facts say that things won't work? Sticking with them. And wanting to be in charge of people that can deal with the facts. Wanting to be in charge of people that can deal with what is actually going on and can deal with reality. Who will respect you for your knowledge, but at the same time, who will call you out if they think that you're doing something stupid. I can and welcome people to call me out if I'm in authority over them, because I can learn from them. I just don't want to be called out by someone spouting some sort of a stupid asinine idea. I'd much rather be called out by somebody that has something to add to the discussion and is actually going to accomplish something by opening his or her mouth. I find that in that regard, I get along best being in charge of people 155, 170, in that range. And as long as there's mutual respect, we can always get along. Usually I like leaving people to their own devices anyway, because I don't want to hamper their creativity. And I figure that people will learn from their mistakes. So it's a very trusting environment, just kind of setting up a big vision and then allowing people to figure out their part in it, and constantly bringing them back to what the point is when people start getting too bogged down in detail. Wrapping up, Lita Hollingworth used a saying about suffering fools gladly, and I think that that can be misinterpreted in many different ways. I think that the point of the words are to suffer fools gladly, not so much to suffer fools. I think that if the emphasis goes onto the word fool too much, then the entire point of the saying goes away, because not everyone is actually a fool. It just oftentimes feels like it when you're functioning on a certain level, and then you wind up having to modulate it down so much in order to actually make it work from a social perspective. So, in wrapping up, we can go over what it is that we've talked about. We've talked about IQ scores. We've talked about plus 2, 3, 4, 5 levels of giftedness in terms of standard deviations. We've talked about intensity. We've talked about religion. We've talked about what is appropriate in terms of expecting certain things out of people at certain developmental stages, and knowing that there is no cookie cutter mold for a profoundly gifted person, and so the educators and parents and so on should be pretty well equipped to play it by ear, as opposed to expecting any kind of a book to actually work. I'll say at this point that I deliberately didn't talk too much about my education, because honestly my education was very incidental. I went to high school when I was 8. I went to university when I was 11. Graduated when I was 16 with 2 degrees. Went to grad school, kind of lost track of my life with regard to life and love and so on, and got stuff sorted out. It wasn't, in my mind, anything particularly spectacular. It just happened, and it was made possible by a few wonderful people, not the least of whom is Jeff Stallman. Another profound impact would have been Judy Beecher. And then my parents. Dr. Lewis Hogarth was my favorite teacher, and generally there were a few people that kind of helped along the way and made the path easier to tread, but it just kind of felt like the normal thing to do at the time. School wasn't my life. I really enjoyed the airplanes more than the school. And having understanding older people that understood the difference in between mental and physical age and emotional development and so on, and were able to be supportive, as well as classmates that were willing to bear with me in my obviously interesting situation, were key in keeping me sane. And I have suffered from depression. I mean, you're never quite ever over it, but I have to some extent gotten over depression. I've taught myself how to deal with social relationships. I joined Toastmasters, constantly put myself into positions of giving talks, and whenever I could, I'd get up in front of groups of people and speak because I absolutely hated it. I was afraid of stinging insects, so I went and read my books near beehives in a clover field. I was afraid of heights, so I went rock climbing. It's just one of these questions of knowing your limitations and just forcing yourself past them and pushing past them. And social relationships was the biggest one of my limitations, and I've to some extent pushed past it. To some extent, it's still very difficult for me. Not because the actual getting along with people part is difficult, but because it takes an awful lot to emotionally decompress from spending a lot of prolonged time with other people. I suck at being under authority except in very limited circumstances, and I suck at being in authority except when I'm in charge of competent people. I encourage all profoundly gifted people to know how to suffer fools gladly. I do know that that's not a poor reflection on anyone else. It's just a reflection on how we need to be very caring and understanding in our own walk in this world, so that we can bring out the best in ourselves and in others, and appreciate people for the gifts that they all have. Hopefully this helps, at least to some extent. Thank you very much for your time. I'm Matthew Leineck.